Hello everyone, and welcome to your third and final module of Chapter 8. So this will be our final module for the semester. So we know that Chapter 8 is on thought and language, and our module 8.3 is on language and communication. So this is basically the only language-specific information that you're going to see in this chapter. So early studies of language, we've talked about these two physicians before, Paul Broca and Karl Wernicke. So we had mentioned them, I think, in the biopsych chapter when I talked about the parts of the brain, and I believe I even mentioned them back in one of the first chapters as well. So they basically wanted to find the areas in your brain that were responsible for the production and the comprehension of language. So an aphasia is basically a disorder. It's a language disorder that's caused by damage to the brain structures that support using and understanding your language. So if you remember, Paul Broca, he discovered an area in the frontal lobe, which he termed Broca's area, and it basically controls our ability to articulate speech sounds that compose words. So it's involved in the production of language. Karl Wernicke, on the other hand, found an area in the temporal lobe, which he termed Wernicke's area, and this is the area of the brain most associated with finding the meaning of words. So Broca's area is more involved with speech production, whereas Wernicke's area is more involved with speech comprehension, so understanding speech. So basically, based on that, we see Wernicke's area here and Broca's area here. And so those aphasias that I just mentioned, if you have damage to Broca's area, you would have what's known as Broca's aphasia. And of course, because that's the area that's involved in the production of language, then Broca's aphasia is basically having difficulties producing speech. Whereas if you had damage or an issue in Wernicke's area, which is involved in language comprehension, then you'd have Wernicke's aphasia, which involves difficulty kind of understanding speech, understanding language. So now we'll briefly go through some of the properties of language. So language, it's a little tricky to define, especially when we talk about the differences between language and communication, but for our purposes, we'll define language as a form of communication that involves the use of spoken, written, or gestural symbols that are combined in a rule-based form. So there are some unique features of language, and we say unique when we're kind of comparing them to other types of communication, like for example, animal communication. Human language is able to permit displacement, which means that we are able to communicate about objects and events not present. So we can talk about what we did in the past, what we're going to do in the future. We can talk about what's going on in another area of the world, so it doesn't have to be about the here and now. The second unique feature is that we can produce entirely new meanings. So it is possible for us to utter a sentence that has never been uttered before in the history of mankind. And number three, it tends to be passed down from parents to children. So we do see that although children kind of have some kind of natural ability to acquire language, it is also passed down largely in part from parents or guardians of the children. So there does seem to be that environmental aspect as well there. So language requires us to link different sounds or gestures with different meanings in order to understand and communicate with others. So our language is very symbolic. We use different words and different gestures to refer to different things, and we're able to kind of link all of these things together in order to understand what's being communicated and respond in a way that is comprehensible to others. So we'll talk briefly about the basic ingredients of language. So obviously language can be broken down into small components. So phonemes are what's known as the most basic units of speech sounds. So for example, t would be a phoneme. So the sound made by the letter T, so st, stop, or pot, t. So that T there, and the phonemes are usually kind of indicated by the little slashes on either side. That would be the sound that kind of hard T sound makes. So individual phonemes do not have any meaning by themselves. Phonemes are just the sounds made by particular letters or particular combinations of letters. They're the most basic unit of speech. They're what speech is comprised of, but they don't actually have any meaning on their own. Morphemes, on the other hand, are the smallest meaningful units of language. So phonemes are the smallest, but they don't convey any meaning, whereas morphemes, they're still small, but they are the smallest meaningful unit, so they actually convey some kind of meaning. So they can either be simple words, such as hit, they could be suffixes, so adding on s or ish to the end of a word, or even prefixes, like adding pre onto something. Usually changes the meaning of the word, so it turns it to like before something happened. So for example here, pig would be a morpheme because it has meaning in itself. We know what a pig is, it's an animal. If you add the word s, or sorry, the letter s, which would be adding a suffix to the word pig, you change the meaning. So it's gone from being one pig to multiple pigs, right? So s as a suffix would be considered a morpheme as well, because by adding it, it changes the meaning of the word. Same thing with ish, ish, adding ish as a suffix changes the word to no longer mean that it's a pig, but piggish, as in kind of relating to a pig or being something like a pig. So ish would be considered a morpheme as well, because it does kind of change the meaning of that original word. So any kind of unit of speech that allows you, that kind of carries meaning in itself and either has meaning on its own or by adding it, it changes the meaning of a word, those would be considered morphemes. Our ability to combine units of sound into an infinite number of meanings, which is also known as productivity, is what differentiates language from other forms of communication. So the fact that we can take all these different units and put them together in a whole bunch of different ways and create kind of unique sentences and unique meanings, that's kind of really one of the key aspects of human language. And then finally, semantics is the study of how people come to understand meaning from words. So whenever we talk about semantic anything, we're kind of talking about the meaning of something or the definition of something. So we're able to understand new words based on their morphemes. So if we know what each of the morphemes mean, and then we add them together, we're able to kind of come up with new words that we're able to infer the meaning of. So you may never have heard someone say, I don't know, let's think. You might have, say, tractor, and then you might have tractor-ish. And you've never really heard someone say the word tractor-ish before, but because we know what a tractor is, and we know that the ish prefix typically conveys the meaning of being something like something, then we would know that tractor-ish means something that is like a tractor. So even though you may have never heard the word before, we're still able to kind of put those morphemes together and kind of infer what a word would mean. Then we have syntax. So we've broken speech down into its basic units, the phonemes, the morphemes, and kind of the meanings of the words, the semantic. But syntax is basically how we put the words together to form a sentence. So syntax is the rules for combining words and morphemes into meaningful phrases and sentences. And the most basic units of syntax would be our nouns and our verbs. So the way in which we order the words in a sentence, the way we structure our sentence in order to convey a particular meaning, that will be what we're talking about by our syntax. So we're able to change statements into questions by moving specific words. So for example, a goat is in the garden is one sentence, but if we take the is and move it to the beginning, we can change it from a sentence to a question. So now it's is a goat in the garden. So we can change the words around, change the syntax of a sentence, and the sentence may convey an entirely different meaning. And so syntax basically, as you see in this diagram, allows us to understand understand language by how the words are organized within the sentence. And then finally we have pragmatics. So pragmatics is actually the study of the non-linguistic elements of the language use. So they're not the ones specific to kind of language itself. It basically places a heavy emphasis on the speaker's behaviors and the social settings. So basically pragmatics are kind of the meaning behind the sentence. So we often say things that aren't literally what we mean. So we kind of like break the rules by saying something that isn't really a true statement, but we're still able to kind of understand what is meant by that statement. So pragmatics depends on both the speaker and the listener understanding that the rules are being flouted, that we're not following the traditional rules. And sometimes what is said is not important as how it is said. So for example, if someone said I ate a 50-pound cheeseburger, you probably heard people say stuff like that. You know, I just ate this cake and it must have been like 20 pounds. And so clearly they didn't actually eat a 50-pound cheeseburger. But based on pragmatics, we know that that's kind of a form of exaggeration, so they probably are just really telling us they ate a really big cheeseburger, right? So pragmatics would be kind of inferring the hidden meaning, not taking everything completely literally all the time. So some of the pragmatic rules here, saying what you believe is true, would be kind of a rule, but flouting the rule might be saying my roommate is a giraffe. So if somebody told you the roommate is a giraffe, do you think they are literally living with a giraffe? Probably not. You'd probably think, maybe they're saying the roommate is very tall. Saying only what is relevant. So is my blind date good looking? He's got a great personality. Well, because she's not answering the question directly, she's probably kind of saying that he's not actually that good looking. And then saying as much as you need to. I like my lab partner, but he's no Einstein. So again, obviously he is not actually Einstein. So we have to kind of infer what kind of the hidden meaning behind that sentence would be. So pragmatics is all about looking at what's being said and maybe not necessarily taking it completely literally, but kind of inferring the hidden meaning behind what was said. Now we'll talk briefly about the development of language. So we do see that infants as young as 2 months of age show a preference for speech sounds over similar non-speech sounds. And they prefer non-words if they follow the rules of their language. So if they heard the made-up word strack, they would probably like that word more, or show a preference towards that word rather than something like restack. Because strack, even though it isn't a word, it still kind of follows kind of the rules of what a lot of our words look like. So in the English language, a lot of words start with that STR sound, right? So even though it's not a word itself, it sounds very similar to a lot of our words. It follows the same kind of spelling guidelines as a lot of actual words in the English language. So young children rapidly learn words. They do have what's called a naming explosion when they're very young, and then they have fast mapping, which is basically the ability to map words onto concepts or objects after only a single exposure. So the way in which small children pick up language is actually pretty incredible. They're able to, a lot of the time, hear a word once and actually add it to their vocabulary and kind of understand its meaning automatically. So language learning is more than just imitation and reinforcement. Children do often produce phrases that include incorrect grammar or word forms. They tend to learn irregular verbs and pluralizations on a word-by-word basis. So things like moose, the fact that moose, it's the same plural as it is singular, and fish, and fishes, though a lot of kids will say fishes when they're learning, but kind of over time they learn each of those words individually. And they do not always listen when their parents correct them. So even though as parents, you can be very helpful in terms of helping your child develop language by attempting to correct them when they use the wrong forms of words and stuff, they don't always necessarily listen to those corrections either. So we don't fully understand the process of language learning in children, but we can definitely kind of understand that it is a very complicated process. So here are some milestones in terms of language acquisition and speech. So you can see by around 1 to 2 months, the child should be cooing. 4 to 10 months, they should be babbling, so that's when the consonants start. So instead of all vowel sounds like the cooing, the babbling includes those consonants as well. So ab, a, da, ba. So actually adding in those consonant sounds. From around 8 to 16 months, the single word stage. So they start to say individual words such as up, mama, papa. By 24 months of age, they'll start what they call the two-word stage, in which the child is actually starting to string words together, making kind of that telegraphic speech where they're adding words together. So saying things like go potty, and then from 24 months plus, they start to complete meaningful phrases. So actually putting a bunch of words together in a sentence. So that's kind of just a general. Sorry, I got cut off at the end of the last slide there, but what I was meaning to say is you don't really need to memorize that chart or anything. It's just more of kind of showing you how language slowly develops over time in young children. It has been shown that there seems to be a sensitive period for language learning. So basically a time when children's brains are primed to develop language skills, and it tends to be much easier for a child to adjust to learning a new language than for an adult too. So there does seem to be kind of a set time during development in which it is easier to learn a language or to learn a second language, and that seems to be during kind of middle childhood. So children absorb language almost effortlessly, but this ability appears to fade away starting at around age 7. And we do see that bilingualism has some costs. So as children are growing up, if they're growing up in a bilingual household, they tend to have a bit of a smaller vocabulary in each language and slower word access initially. I guess because, you know, they're trying to build up vocabularies in 2 different languages rather than just one. But overall, these costs initially are greatly outweighed by the benefits. So over time, children who grow up in a bilingual household tend to show increased executive function and actually important health benefits as well. So even though it may be a little more difficult at first, it definitely comes with some long-term benefits. And finally, we'll ask the question, can animals use language? So as much as I'd love to take a long time talking about this, because this is kind of stuck in at the end of this course now, we don't really have as much time to discuss it. But they have done a lot of studies in terms of whether or not animals can use language, can use human language. We have definitely determined that animals don't have language as we humans define language, but a lot of study has gone into trying to see if we can actually teach the animals to use our language. So formal studies of language learning in non-human species gained momentum in around the 1950s. There was a chimpanzee named Vicky who was cross-fostered, so she was raised as a member of a family that was not the same species. Obviously, in this case, she was raised by a family of humans. And they were actually attempting to teach Vicky to speak English, but unfortunately Vicky was only able to whisper about 4 words after several years. So one of the major kind of roadblocks that we have when trying to teach animals human language is that the majority of animals just don't have kind of the vocal cords and the biological equipment to be able to produce the same kind of sounds that we do. So teaching animals to communicate during human language, unless of course you're talking about maybe parrots or some other birds, is very hard, if not impossible. However, in the 1960s, we saw that researchers started attempting to teach chimpanzees sign language. And there were several chimpanzees and other monkeys who were actually able to learn a lot of sign language. So Washoe, for example, was eventually able to learn around 200 signs. You've probably also heard of Coco. There was a bonobo monkey named Kanzi who was taught an artificial language using symbols, and he actually learned about 350 symbols and seemed to be able to recognize about 3,000 words. So attempts to teach animals to use our language have been somewhat effective. However, we would say that they're still not really using it in the way we do, in terms of being able to like kind of have those properties of language that we talked about earlier. But we definitely are able to be at least moderately successful in teaching some animals to communicate using our language, at least at, you know, say a toddler level or the level of a small child. So despite all of these attempts, there's still debate over whether animals are actually using language. We do see that they communicate only with symbols, not with phrase-based syntax like we use. There's little evidence that they pass it on to their children, and it lacks productivity in terms of them being able to make kind of an unlimited amount of new utterances and things like that. There may also be issues with attachment, so a lot of the people who have worked with these animals have worked very closely with the animals and probably developed somewhat of an attachment to them, and of course that could bias the results if they're, you know, wanting to see positive results. There may be some biases there. So overall, we would say that animals don't really have the capacity for human language, but we are able to teach them, you know, a limited amount of the English language, and I guess human language in general. So that is the end of this module. Pretty short. I mean, as long as you can keep your terms in mind, that's really all we're looking for here. It's not going to be a major section on your test or anything. So I hope you enjoyed this section, and I hope you enjoyed the course so far. I'm really going to try, if you're taking the second course with me in the winter, to get a lot of the notes done up and recorded over Christmas so we can have things a little bit earlier next semester. And so yeah, I hope to see you in that course. And good luck with your finals, everyone. I'll talk to you later.